Fox News Podcast presents Bret Baier's All-Star Panel.
America's got to be in the lead if you want to deal with these threats. We're going to lead.
The mourning is over. The Shiva is done. And if you're a conservative, you should be optimistic.
You know, my main priority right now is making sure that it delivers for the American people.
We have to make our country great again, and I will do that.
I think the president gets criticized by people all the time for the stuff he says, by people who ignore what he does.
Now, Fox's chief political anchor, Bret Baier.
As Israel extends its offensive further into Gaza, President Biden has given an ultimatum to Israel, stating in an interview with CNN's Aaron Burnett last week he will hold off supplying the Israeli military with more weapons if Israel launches a major invasion into Rafah, causing varied backlash from both sides of the aisle.
If they go into Rafah, I'm not supplying the weapons that have been used historically to deal with Rafah.
Here at home, voters head to the polls in West Virginia, Maryland, and Nebraska, with stakes high in West Virginia and Maryland's Senate primaries as Republicans set out to flip two important Senate seats. And in New York, former President Donald Trump's hush money trial continues as more developments emerge as Michael Cohen takes the stand and multiple Trump allies speak out outside the courthouse on Tuesday. To discuss all of this and more, we'll bring in our panel. Former State Department spokesperson and founder of POLARIS National Security, Morgan Ortagus, Fox News senior congressional correspondent Chad Pergram, and Fox News contributor and host of the Richard Fowler Show, Richard Fowler. Chad, I know you're in New York. You're outside another trial, the Bob Menendez trial that's starting the jury selection. That's the New Jersey Democratic senator charged with bribery. And so we've got trials just down the block from one another.
In fact, when former President Trump goes to trial each day, that motorcade passes right past the Daniel Patrick Moynihan courthouse nearby here. And yesterday afternoon, there were a number of pro-Trump demonstrators waving flags, and President Trump acknowledged them waving through the window here. So these trials are not connected in any way, shape, or form, but they are connected in Lower Manhattan as the wheels of justice turn here. The Bob Menendez case, this is his second dance at the rodeo here. You know, he was on trial in 2017. That was a completely unrelated set of charges, bribery. He wasn't acquitted in that case. Basically what happened is that there was a hung jury, and that fueled his re-election run in 2018, and the feds say that's when the trouble started. He is accused of operating as a foreign agent for Qatar and Egypt. And also one of the things in the prosecution, or one of the things the defense counsel might try to offer here, his wife, Nadine, is also going to be on trial later this summer. She's basically charged with the same thing here. And what they might do, we're told, is try to throw her under the bus and say it wasn't the senator who was currying favor here and accepting these bribes, including a Mercedes-Benz and gold bars, 13 of them. The senator even looked up the cost of gold bars, we're told. But that they might say, look, it was her, and see if the senator can get off scot-free here. Again, I will say something that I noticed, Brett, that's very interesting. When he went on trial in 2017, Cory Booker, his Garden State colleague, was front and center at the trial to show support for Senator Menendez on the first day. He testified as a character witness. Lindsey Graham, the Republican senator from South Carolina, also testified as a character witness. I found Cory Booker in the hall the other day in the Dirksen Senate office building, and I asked him, will he be paying attention to the trial? And he says, no, not really at all. He said, we'll see what happens with the verdict, but he's not up here engaged in that. This kind of shows you, at least in the perception of Democratic senators, how far Bob Menendez has fallen here, because some were willing to stand by him last time. Many of them want him to resign. He's not going to do that. We don't even know if he's going to run for re-election. If he does so, he'll probably do so as an independent. The filing deadline is the 4th of June. The trial probably won't conclude until about a month after that, Brett.
A busy New York street behind you there, Chad, and the whole legal theory of throwing the wife under the bus could make for a tough Valentine's Day. But let me turn, Richard, to the former president's trial. Michael Cohen on the stand, the self-described fixer for Mr. Trump at the time. And obviously, in cross-examination, he is going to be grilled on his credibility. He's obviously been convicted of lying under oath numerous times. He has presented a case that prosecutors are trying to say is falsifying business records to cover up payments to Stormy Daniels, the adult film star who alleges she had sexual relations with the former president. So prosecutors saying that amounts to illegal campaign contributions before the 2016 election. Richard, there's a lot of people, supporters of the former president who say, where's the crime here? They go down this road. People like Vivek Ramaswamy and Byron Donalds, others, supporters, Governor Pergram. There's been a host of people that now are at microphones every day. What's your thought about, one, where this case is, and two, what Democrats think about the possibility of the political impact of this case, which may be the only case that we see adjudicated before the election?
I think that's right. This will probably likely be the only case adjudicated before the election. And for the prosecution, Alvin Bragg's prosecution, the New York the Manhattan DA here, they walk into this week with their all-star witness, who you just alluded to, Brett, whose testimony is dubious at best at this point. But this is their all-star witness, and he is the witness that will point to the money he got back. He is the witness that will bring in invoices that show the Trump organization paying him back for paying off Stormy Daniels, right? And he paid her off right after the Access Hollywood tapes came out, and when we find the Trump campaign in 2016 in the bit of a scramble. Now, there's a lot of us outside of this courtroom who have prognosticated on how this is going to go down, but this will ultimately come down to the 12 jurors in that room. And I think that's how you have to evaluate the politics of it. While this is happening, every major news network is covering this wall to wall, and we're not having a conversation about probably some of the issues that the Biden team wants you to talk about. For example, the $18 billion in new tariffs to China, which happens this week, or the fact that the vice president has been barnstorming the country, talking about economic opportunity, talking about access to reproductive health, talking about all the things that are sort of the key components of their campaign. And so we're going to have to see what happens here. The good news for the Biden team in this moment is time is on their side. And the bad news for the Trump team is that you're seeing this static picture of the former president in the courtroom. It's working for his base. The question now will be, is this working for independents? Some polls show that it might be. But once again, I think those polls are a little bit early, given that we have a long time between now and Election Day, and a lot of things can move before then.
Yeah, that's definitely true. A lot of shoes can drop in the next 5.5 months, Morgan, but there is this sense, even in independents, even in some Democrats who I think are wondering, where the there is and how this comes out.
I think you're absolutely right. We've seen these sort of scandals. I mean, look, if you go back into the 90s, into the Bill Clinton impeachment, ultimately the American people, this is not something they wanted. They didn't want the president impeached over something that they deemed as sort of a tawdry affair. I'd also note this week, the New York Times had an article out showing new polling with Trump well ahead in some of the major key battleground states, above the margin of error. And these polls are taking during the middle of the time, as Richard just pointed out, that the former president is on television every day, going through a trial. So listen, to be clear, nobody from the Trump campaign wants this, but I do think from a political perspective, they're handling it as well as they can. You're starting to see them bring senators, the Speaker of the House, other members of Congress to come out and speak to the cameras and really defend Trump in a way that he can't because of a gag order. Again, nobody wants to be in this predicament, but I do think that Trump's political team is playing it as best they can now, using these surrogates, now having party leaders and VP hopefuls line up behind the president to defend him. We'll hear more after this. Chad, what is the feeling on Capitol Hill as we're 5.5 months out? Obviously, the Senate map looks good for Republicans at this point. They really only have to win West Virginia and the White House, but they have a lot of different opportunities to flip some seats. The House map seems a little more vague and up in the air.
Absolutely. And the thing that I think is interesting, the reason that Republicans won control of the House last time was because of seats in California and also seats in New York. Now, what we saw, and this is Speaker Johnson's second trip to New York in just a couple of weeks. He came up here a few weeks ago when we had those demonstrations at Columbia University. He met with the president of Columbia University, and he brought with him some of these vulnerable Republicans who flipped these seats in New York State. Mike Lawler, Nick LaLota. You get the idea here. People who came up who have these swing districts to kind of use this as a wedge issue against the Democrats. And it goes right through New York State because of some of the disconnect between the Democratic base and the president and the core of the Democratic Party over what's been happening in Israel and the Middle East and with Gaza. That's going to be key. I will also point out just the idea that Mike Johnson came to New York. That was, number one, showing solidarity for former President Trump. He's trying to show a unified base here. Keep in mind that he just survived this effort by Marjorie Taylor Greene to remove him as the House Speaker a couple of weeks ago. Wasn't very successful. Only 11 Republicans voted in favor of trying to get to a vote to actually do that. Not nearly the votes, but that's more votes than Kevin McCarthy lost in October of last year. This visit up to New York today with former President Trump was not so much about President Trump, but also about Mike Johnson. If the Republicans hold control of the House, it's going to be a narrow majority. And as I've said to you before, Brett, figuring out who to elect as Speaker, be that Mike Johnson or somebody else, that is going to be challenging when we get to January of 2025, because you only have a slim majority. It took them 5 days in January last time. It took them 22 days last October. And the other thing that's kind of frightening in all this here is that they start that certification of the Electoral College on January 6th, as we all well now know. The Speaker election, the first thing that Congress has to do is elect a Speaker. You can't do anything until you elect a Speaker of the House. So if this takes a couple of days, you could see where that bleeds in to the certification of the Electoral College on the 6th of January. So again, if you can't get a Speaker of the House. So that's why, election of the House of Representatives is going to be paramount. And Mike Johnson is also trying to curry some favor with the former president. This is why he went to Mar-a-Lago a few weeks ago in this voter integrity project as well. And some of the people who are showing up here in New York City alongside the president, it's just not to show support for former President Trump, but also to kind of audition for potential cabinet slots. Byron Donalds, Mike Waltz has been up here, talking about him as well. So, those are people I would keep an eye on as we get deeper into these legal issues and kind of look at this surrogate campaign that's going on behind the scenes for a possible Trump cabinet if he wins and becomes president in 2025.
Yeah, that's definitely true. And also, don't forget the apprentice-like VP hunt that we likely will have ahead of the convention. Richard, you mentioned the tariffs on China, and President Biden did put out this statement saying, I just imposed a series of tariffs on goods made in China, 25% on steel and aluminum, 50% on semiconductors, 100% on EVs, 50% on solar panels. China is determined to dominate these industries. I'm determined to ensure America leads the world in them. Now, there's a lot of people looking at that saying this is an effort by President Biden to triangulate and try to take an issue away from former President Trump. In 2019, this is the tweet that Joe Biden sent out. Yet more proof that Trump doesn't care about the farmers, workers, and consumers that are being crushed by his irresponsible tariff war with China. It's easy to act tough when someone else is feeling the pain. I will reverse his senseless policies. So that's what he said in 2019 about the tariffs, and now he's installing those same very tariffs. I guess what people look at that is a little cynically, I think, and maybe we're going to see some more of that with some executive orders on border and some other things that maybe he tries to take away from an argument that the former president is making for election.
Well, Brett, I will start here and say this. As they always say in Washington, D.C., you campaign in poems and you govern in prose. And I think what you're seeing here in this White House is just that. They realized coming in that some of the protectionist policies put in place by the Trump administration worked well. And they also see that, to Chad's point, if you sort of extend that across, the impact that can have on this upcoming election, especially in some of these sort of on these sort of flip House districts, right? These districts that live in the 50-50 margin. And I think that's why you see the Biden administration, we saw them last week, open a new plant or cut the ribbon for a new AI plant in Wisconsin. And I think if you look and you zero in on the House specifically, and why I think you see Mike Johnson, the speaker in New York, so much, is because the House is really up for grabs, right? Because of one, redistricting that gives a favorable seat to Democrats in Alabama as well as Louisiana, but two, in many of these New York races where Republicans were able to pick up in 2022, these conversations around manufacturing are happening in kitchen tables. And so the Biden team is trying to pick up on that, trying to see how they can couple these tariffs with the semiconductors bill they passed a little bit in the middle of his term, this part of his term, and put those two things together and create a case that Biden is the best president for the American working class. Now, it's going to be up to those working class voters to obviously make that determination, but the Biden team is trying to work to show those voters that he stands on their side.
Yeah, it is politics, obviously, Morgan, but to be so adamant in 2019 and now absolutely turn around the other way, and to be so adamant that all of the immigration and border stuff was going to be overturned and reversed, and now to be considering changes, executive orders and asylum rules is really interesting. And lastly, what about the policy on Israel and Gaza? It seems like the administration is trying to walk this line to have it both ways, and it's having neither way, according to polls.
Yeah, I mean, listen, this is what an election year will do to your policy for sure. I mean, listen, I think these were bold moves as first on the tariffs from the Biden administration. However, the devil is always in the details in these things. And right now, when I talk to industry, Brett, most of their concern is that China will set up shop in Mexico, is setting up shop in Mexico, and looking to potentially send Chinese EVs through the southern border using USMCA. So continue to watch that space. I think, listen, in Michigan and other places, the Biden administration knows that the union workers do not like the EVs. And one just has to look to Germany and look to Western Europe in general, where China is absolutely flooding their markets with EVs, to see what a problem it would be in the United States. So whether it's there in the border, but as you brought up, on the Israel point, I mean, Biden, the president, is clearly underwater, especially with young people. What was amazing about that New York Times poll that I referenced in the first answer with you is that young people actually, maybe this is just a lack of education on their part, but they actually gave former President Trump a few points more on who would they trust to handle the Israel situation. And I think that President Biden and his national security team are in a pickle that they have created for themselves. I listened to or read a fascinating interview from the number 3 at the State Department, outgoing undersecretary. She used to be a State Department spokesperson, Victoria Nuland. And she expressed this week, Brett, that she thought that the Biden team made a mistake by embracing the Abraham Accords too much. What's amazing to me about that is they're talking about embracing peace deals, the first peace deal in 26 years between Israel and Arab states. And they haven't taken into full account that 3.5 years of appeasing Iran is actually what led us to where we are today. They haven't fully understood that trying to go back to that second-term Obama administration policy for the Middle East is what actually led us to this disastrous situation. And I think from what I hear, they say it behind closed doors, but until they, fully admit that their Iran policy has been fatally flawed and reversed course, they're going to continue to have these problems in the Middle East. And they're just trying to split the baby. They're trying to make their base happy while also not inflaming Jewish Democratic voters and supporters. And this is one of those where you can't really split the baby on this policy. You got to pick a side, and they're trying to pick both sides, which just is not going to work in an election year, clearly.
Panel, we'll hold it right there. And Chad, we're seeing it with lawmakers, Democrats. I mean, obviously, we've talked to Senator Fetterman. You've talked to him. I talked to him on set recently. Others that are speaking out boldly and much more pro-Israel and questioning, the policy, specifically the weapons policies.
Yeah, there's going to be a vote, a non-binding resolution in the House of Representatives later this week. that deals with that. And, there was a group of 26 Democrats who, wrote a letter to President Biden, kind of concerned about this, about how they were handling this. How they're going to vote on that resolution is going to be very telling of that divide inside the Democratic Party and how they manage those schisms in their caucus over this very, lightning issue.
Richards, you have some known Democrats, strategists expressing some worry publicly. James Carville and his podcast, he's always colorful, but he's especially loud these days, saying things are going the wrong way as he looks at the swing state polls and where things stand. We're 5.5 months out, and we all know that people really start focusing after Memorial Day, after the conventions, and if we're going to get debates or not. But by the time the fall comes, people start to focus in. What is your sense of the Democratic Party about where things stand? Is it red alert, warning, sirens going off?
Listen, I definitely think there are some concerned Democrats in this moment. And I think if you talk to folks both inside and close to the president, inside the party and outside the party apparatus who are on the Democratic side, they will tell you they're definitely nervous about the polls that they're seeing. But with that being said, to your point, this 5-month period, they believe a lot can happen in that time frame. One, they believe that there could probably be some sort of resolution in the Israel-Gaza crisis. They also believe that the economic numbers could turn in their favor. And they also believe that, look, when you look at these polls are talking about folks, even when you're looking at likely voters versus, folks who are unlikely voters, they're thinking about their voter universe. Many of the voter universes, many of the folks who are in the voter universe that voted for Biden in 2020 are folks who are unlikely voters, folks that pollsters were not picking up. And so the Democrats are going to try to see, can we gin up support in these groups again? Can we woo over these voters back to our side? I think the critical voting block for them in this moment will be African-American, but specifically Black men. And there's been a lot of polls that show that Black men are moving Trump's way. But if you look at the key issues that Democrats are running on, and abortion is one of them, or reproductive access for women, we saw that tested beyond the polling. We saw that actually tested at the ballot box in Ohio, where this past November, voters went to Ohio to protect a woman's right to choose. And the number one demographic that voted to protect a woman's right to choose, more so than Black women, more so than white women, was Black men. They voted 12 points higher than any other subgroup. And so the question I think that Democrats should be asking themselves is, what happened in Ohio? How can we take that magic and put it in a place like Michigan? How can we take that magic and put it in a place like Wisconsin and maintain those states for Joe Biden? And how can we also take that magic and put it in a place like Western Pennsylvania, where the demographics are very similar?
Final word, Morgan. On the flip side, the Trump people seem more emboldened, seem like they're trying to expand the map. Obviously, you had this big rally in New Jersey that provided some big visuals of the crowd, whatever the final number ended up being there. And, he's looking at Minnesota and Virginia and other states that maybe Republicans have written off in the past. So these 5 months are really going to be something.
They are going to be. Within a matter of weeks, we'll know the outcome of the trial and what that means. This is probably the question I get asked, Brett, on a daily basis from people who aren't in politics. What's going to happen in November? Listen, we haven't even discussed one of the biggest remaining elephants in the room for both campaigns, and that's RFK and his candidacy, which isn't going anywhere and seems to be taking from both sides. I think both campaigns would prefer to get him out of the race, but they, likely can't do so. So I think that remains one of the biggest, unknowns. But as it relates to what's going on in the fall, listen, I think New Jersey made a lot of sense in the fact that it got the former president energized, got him in front of a big crowd again, especially when he's spending every day in a courtroom stifled in a way that he doesn't want to. But ultimately, what does it all come down to? I referenced this New York Times piece 3 times today, so I guess I'll just reference it again with the one where we were talking about the polling. But one of the most fascinating interviews in that piece was of a young woman, middle-class woman who's a registered nurse, which is, requires a decent amount of schooling. That's a very good salary for someone who's an RN. And she said in the New York Times piece, Brett, that when she goes to the grocery store, she no longer buys like Jiffy peanut butter. She buys store brand peanut butter. And I thought that is the election right there. So all of the things that we're talking about, the trials, the Chinese tariffs on AVs, all these things come down to in November, when you go to the grocery store, are you buying Jiffy or are you buying store brand? And if you're still buying store brand peanut butter in November, I think it's a Trump win.
There you go. Comes down to the peanut butter. All right. Thank you all. Now for a bit of history. On May 14th, 1804, Meriwether Lewis and William Clark departed St. Louis on their expedition to explore the Northwest. The expedition had discovered and cataloged 178 new plants, 122 new species and subspecies of animals. Among those cataloged were bighorn sheep, mule deer, grizzly bears, prairie dogs, and pronghorn antelope. Lewis and Clark arrived at the Pacific coast of Oregon in November of 1805, returned to St. Louis in September of 1806, completing a journey of about 6,000 miles. There you go. That'll do it for this week. You can hear more of this series at foxnewspodcast.com or wherever you download podcasts. Make sure to leave a rating and a review. We want to hear from you. For Morgan, Richard, and Chad, I'm Brett Baer. We'll see you next time. Listen ad-free with a Fox News Podcast Plus subscription on Apple Podcasts, and Amazon Prime members can listen to this show ad-free on the Amazon Music app.